Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jake LaQuire. And we've been on a little bit of a hiatus. We haven't spoken to you all since after the Super Bowl. And kind of the gap between the Super Bowl and the Combine is that weird off-season period between the end of one NFL season and the start of another, when we're seeing arguably the two best teams perform with some of the best players in the NFL, to looking at some of the best prospects heading into the draft season. And I wish I could take credit for this analogy, but Sean Syed and Tej Seth on their podcast, Stats and Scheme, really got into a really great analogy of this time duration. And it's almost like the time in between Christmas and New Year's, where you're spending time with people that you typically wouldn't throughout the year. You have time off. And to add on to that, growing up as a kid, my grandparents would kind of give an allowance. You'd have a little bit of spending money to go to the stores and buy stuff. And my big thing was Legos growing up. I actually have gotten a couple Lego sets as an adult, and it's always fun to build those and put them together. But with that allowance, depending on what Lego sets were out, depended on the bundle that I would kind of build. If I wanted a big set, that would typically take all of that money. And if I wanted a couple little smaller sets, I could do that with the money allotted as well. And so depending on the availability of Lego sets and how much I had to spend determined what that outlook looked like, the utility I would get from that bundle. And similarly, NFL front offices now go into this offseason knowing the cap that they have, the restraints on kind of their spending, and what's available not only in the draft with some of these prospects, but players that are becoming free agents that are going to hit the open market. And are they worth the contract that they might demand from other teams? So I think this is a good way to kind of kick off free agency. And it's going to be fun because I think it's going to cause a kind of domino effect that'll lead to some trades and some big names moving to different teams.
Like a Debo Samuel sized Lego set, maybe being shipped from California to over there in Maryland. You're around between Philly and North Carolina. Maryland's right in the middle there, so I think that analogy tracks as well. But yeah, we went through kind of the first dead period of the offseason between the Super Bowl and then the Combine. Now we have all the pro days and free agency starting next Monday, or technically next Wednesday, but the negotiating period starts on Monday, which means that's when free agency really starts. And then we'll be good for a while up until the end of April with the draft. And then after that, it's going to be a rough 2 months there until OTAs and stuff. But we're in a good zone right now. Like you're saying, free agency is about to start. We've already seen some deals happen. We've seen some players get cut to create some cap space, right? A big one today was Javon Hargrave, the defensive tackle for the San Francisco 49ers. He was like their star acquisition, 2 off seasons ago now? And now they're letting him go. So just goes to show how quick turnover can be in the NFL. But I think it's a good point that we start with the franchise tag or the transition tag, because the deadline for that was actually on Tuesday. We're recording this on a Thursday. We had 2 people get tagged. I think that's the least since 2016 when they, maybe 2015, when they introduced the transition tag as well. Only 2 people tagged. One being T. Higgins. This is the second year in a row he's gotten franchise tagged. And the other being the guard Trey Smith for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah. And it's very interesting to see that there aren't a lot of big names in this free agency class. And obviously that lends itself to exactly what you just saw. And that's only 2 players being franchise tagged. What's interesting is some of the domino effects that have already come off of that. I don't know if Sam Hubbard was necessarily pressured into retirement, but I know the Bengals were probably asking about a pay cut or looking to save some money with his contract. And he hung it up afterwards. From the Chiefs standpoint, they went ahead and they traded away Joe Thuney because they needed to get underneath the cap before the league new year, which is coming up relatively soon. And that kind of cleared some room for them to extend Trey Smith, who it seems to be the future for Kansas City at the right guard position. So just some interesting rumblings just off of those tags. But I think what'll be kind of key, and we'll go position by position really quickly, but from now leading up to the draft, we're going to be breaking down positions of not only draft prospects, but free agent ones as well. We'll kind of list off kind of the top players we think at each position that might get the most APY. Could be a one-year deal, that could be a multi-year deal, but really kind of talk about what the market looks like to see kind of what bundles these general managers around the NFL can kind of piece together. And then I think we'll wrap up, since this is a Panthers podcast, with what we think Dan Morgan, Brant Tillis, and Dave Canales should do with kind of rebuilding this team.
For sure. I think it's a good way to kick off like the big offseason part, right, with the list of free agents, and none more important than the quarterback position, right? And taking a look at this free agent class, it's not great. It's not like it was a couple years ago when Lamar Jackson was available when he was tagged. He eventually re-signed with the Ravens and went on to win another MVP. But this time we have interesting pieces, so to speak. We have guys like Jameis Winston, who had an iffy year with the Browns, probably a career backup at this point. We have a guy like Aaron Rodgers, who that whole experiment flamed out in New York. Might go to the other New York team. You never know. That he's kind of like a package deal with Devontae Adams at this point. But I think the guy who's going to get paid the most is actually Sam Darnold. I think we might see a little bit of a Baker Geno Smith arc where they get the minimum contract later in their careers. But if I'm a team and I look at how he turned into, as you so lovingly put at the time, a pumpkin in those big games toward the end of the season and in the playoffs, I can't in good conscience be a team like Indy and be like, hey, let's give this guy $25 million on a prove-it contract. That doesn't sit right with me.
Well, 25 I would take. I think some of the numbers that I would be wary of, he's going to get this car or Cousins extension. And I know everybody's saying Darnold's not on that level, but that's the contract Daniel Jones just got a couple years ago after a big performance. And so this is kind of the buyer beware situation for Sam Darnold, is you have a couple of these teams that are truly quarterback needy. And it's like, if you reach for him and pay him too much money, you're going to be regretting in an offseason or two and putting yourself in a financial hole that you have no business putting yourself into. So again, I think if he goes to the right situation, it is, like you said, a Baker Mayfield, a Geno Smith deal where you're making around 30, maybe 35 a year, and the team signing you can get out after 2 years. I think in that case, in that scenario, Sam Darnold gets job security, gets a lot of guaranteed money, but the team doesn't feel like they're strapped to Darnold and they can use him as a bridge quarterback to the future.
With that in mind, do you think he goes back to the Vikings? Like, I know JJ McCarthy is healthy now. He should be the guy. They took him. Technically, they traded up into the top 10 to take him. Do you think he goes back to the Vikings, or maybe a team like Tennessee if they trade out of that number one pick? Or, like I said, the Colts, maybe one of those in-between teams tries to go out and land Darnold. Where do you think he's going to end up?
I'm not exactly sure. I could see like a team like Las Vegas, since they've been quarterback needy, they missed out on Stafford, they missed out on a couple of these other players, that they try to just sign him and have him be the stopgap guy. But obviously, they've tried that the past couple off seasons, Minshew being the latest kind of failure in that department. So maybe they kind of go a different direction. So it might be a team like Tennessee, like you're saying, if they don't think Cam Ward's the guy and they want to build around a quarterback. But again, I don't think they have the offensive line to protect Darnold and kind of keep away the ghosts that have haunted him in the past. So with that being said, I think when you talk about him going back to Minnesota, I think Kwesi needs to take the same approach he took with Cousins, that he's not worth the money that he's going to command. If anything, you re-sign the guy you signed mid-season to a one-year deal, and that's Daniel Jones. Have him be the back if JJ McCarthy isn't 100% by week one, or if he does go down again with another injury, that you have some stability at that position that already is kind of up the speed with the playbook.
For sure. And then there's other veterans like both Russell Wilson and Justin Fields are available. I don't think there's going to be any shortage of backup QB level play in free agency this year. Luckily, we re-signed our backup, Andy Dalton. I think it was before we took our break. So we have our backup, and we assume our franchise guy for the foreseeable future. So we're locked in pretty good there. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but the Stafford trade, not trade, I think kind of forced some things in the QB market, especially in regards to Aaron Rodgers and Darnold. So we'll have to see how that works out there. I think the next position to look at is who Darnold or whoever these QBs are throwing to. One of the biggest needs for the Panthers is like a true number one wide receiver. And with a lot of the veterans being released in this offseason, not sure that you're going to get a true number one without a trade, aka DK Metcalf, but you might have some useful players in there, like Devontae Adams. We talked about it. He's released. He's probably going to end up with Aaron Rodgers. Stephon Diggs coming off the ACL tear. He had a nice contract in line, but they worked it out in Houston. He's a free agent now. Amari Cooper's a free agent. Yes, some among the margins guys too, like Darius Slayton. Tutu Atwell just got signed to, I think, a favorable deal for him earlier today, $10 million over 1 year, and I think it's all guaranteed. But I think the big name now left is Chris Godwin. He's coming off of a big injury, but before he did that, I believe he was leading all receivers in yards after the catch at that point, and he was playing his best ball with Baker Mayfield this past season. Could he be a reunion candidate with Dave Canales? Maybe a Tyler Lockett as well, as he was released by Seattle?
Well, I think to that point about Chris Godwin, I would actually say he might be someone to keep an eye out with going to Jacksonville and following Liam Cohen, who he was having that statistically great season with, who was scheming him as a wide receiver in some really advantageous situations. So I could definitely see him going to Jacksonville. I definitely think there's going to be some pull to Carolina, obviously reuniting with Brad Idzik and Dave Canales. And so there's a lot of different avenues where that could go. I think when you start looking at the wide receiver market as a whole, we just saw this with the quarterback market, and we're going to see it a lot more with some of these premium positions we're going to talk about. There's no like top guys available. Nobody that's like top five at their position. And when you look at kind of this list and you look at it in comparison with kind of the APY that those players demand, it's just not even close. So a guy like Chris Godwin, I think the reason why he would become a free agent is he's already signed his second big extension after that rookie contract. So he's in line for his third contract. He's obviously getting older. I think he's close to 30. Obviously, like you said, coming off that big major injury, there are factors that are in play as to why some of these bigger names are available. If this was 2 or 3 years ago and Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper were all like free agents, it would be a mad scene in free agency. But when those players are good and still in their primes, teams retain them. The fact that they're on the market is exactly what you said at the top of this segment. Like, that's all they are. They're big names, but they're guys that you can bring in, have a veteran presence in the locker room, and you know that they're going to show up on Sunday and make a play or two for you. But they are not the difference makers that they once used to be.
For sure. You don't really get difference makers in NFL free agency anymore. I was going to say free agency in general, but NBA free agency is that feeding frenzy that you talk about, or at least it used to be. It's kind of tapered off as well. Running back, not necessarily as flashy as wide receiver. We saw last year and I think the year before, all these running backs, like the Renaissance, they're getting big contracts again. And Saquon Barkley just signed an extension with the Eagles, or like on top of his existing deal with the Eagles, to get over $40 million over 2 years. I think it's just under $21 million per year. That dwarfs Christian McCaffrey's league-leading deal, and now like sets the market for running backs in the future. None of the guys in free agency this year, I think, are even going to approach that. You have guys like Najee Harris, who's been a stalwart, more or less, for the Steelers over the past couple of years. Javonte Williams is another big name. He's dealt with some injuries there. Do you see any big running back contracts happening this offseason? And I'm talking about the size of like when, not necessarily Saquon, but we had Derrick Henry signed to a new team. We had like all these spot starters and good starters move different teams. You think we're going to see that with any of the running back free agents this go around?
Of the free agents, no. But there is a player to monitor, and the only reason is it's his older brother. Used to play in the NFL. Actually, I think still was on a roster last year. Represented by the same agency. He got, if you look at inflated APY, about $17 million a year on his second extension, or first extension, second contract. And so that player being James Cook in Buffalo, wanting kind of over the 15 million threshold. You just saw Saquon got it. He balled out this past year, had a big game against the Chiefs in the playoffs. Like, I can understand it from his point of view, is that you want to make sure you're getting your bag. And it could be one of those situations where, to make him happy, you fudge some numbers, make the APY look a little bit bigger, give him a guaranteed money kind of number that makes him happy. But it's not exactly like this 16, 17, $18 million contract. You're just kind of giving him what he wants, making it look pretty, and moving on. But out of the free agents available, Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, they aren't going to command near the kind of money that we just saw Saquon got extended to.
Yeah, the top three players combined in that position still might not get to what Saquon got. James Cook, for that reason, I know Josh Allen won MVP and he was phenomenal this year, but if their offense was a V8, Cook was worth 3 of the cylinders there. He was very, very good. Like you said, I think he was probably the best player in that playoff game. Obviously, they fell just short, but I think the Bills are smart. I don't know if they're going to overpay. They just drafted a guy in Ray Davis that they like, and this is a big running back draft class, which is going to have a big impact on the position as a whole. We look last year, not a great running back draft class. The only one probably worth taking early was Jonathan Brooks, and he gets hurt later in the season. So that had a big impact there. You got to always look at the draft, right? Because that's cheap, young labor as opposed to experienced but already worn down labor, and I think that's going to play a big part. Shifting. Oh, we still have tight ends. There's some.
Well, we still have left tackle. Let's talk about left tackle.
Oh, you want to go in order here? Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. No. So left tackle. Again, another premium position. You aren't going to see big names hit this. Like at best, it's going to be a trade scenario like with Trent Williams, which again, he should have never been traded. Like how Washington handled that, and that really was a indictment of how bad Dan Snyder was. And if you didn't see the 8-win turnaround this year, then clearly you're blind as to the problems going on there. But with left tackle, I think the only guy that's really available is Jedrick Wills. Browns are in a really bad situation cap-wise. They might be able to get underneath a little bit and fudge some numbers on an extension with him. He just has a big injury history. And again, going back to Chris Godwin, when you see some of these really good talents hit the open market, it tends to be because there's other hesitations about that player, regardless of the production that we see when they are healthy.
Yeah, former top 10 pick with Jedrick Wills as well. And then when healthy, those first couple years was pretty good. Obviously, downturn with injuries. Another guy who's kind of the opposite, I would say, who started his career with a lot of injuries, but has been more healthy as of late, Ronnie Stanley, the Ravens left tackle. I think he's closer to 30 than Jedrick Wills is, but with teams like the Chiefs needing strong offensive line help, I could see them kind of going in that direction. I believe, didn't they get Orlando Brown from the Ravens initially? They traded for him, right? It was like a second and first swap or something like that. Maybe they poach another Ravens tackle and slide him along the left side there. Another guy, Patrick McCarry, not going to be as expensive as Stanley is or Wills, because that, like over the cap says, Jason Fitzgerald, that top 10 pedigree, like that former draft pick, says a lot. Like you're going to get more money even if you weren't as good. Like it's a good example. Like Javon Kinlaw with the Jets, he got good money even though he wasn't super good with the 49ers. But yeah, like you're saying, premium position, not a lot of elite talent there. As far as interior offensive line goes, we already talked about it. If you want elite players, you're going to have to tag them like Trey Smith or trade for him. And I think the Bears trading for 2 people that can start and probably will be plus starters if they're healthy says a lot about the guard market this year. Ben Johnson at the Combine says he wants to follow the Panthers. Yes, our Panthers, your Panthers model of finding 2 good starting guards in free agency to kind of start that O-line rebuild. Well, they couldn't find him in free agency, so they traded for him. You already mentioned they got Joe Thuney from the Chiefs, but they also traded for Jonah Jackson from the Rams. I think each time they took on the entire contract because they had so much cap space, they were able to do so. That also lowered the asking price. But as far as guards go, you might have to trade for some people, or you might have to get somebody in the draft this year. Not a lot of great offensive line, I would say, in this draft, but there are some good day 2 guards you could go after.
Absolutely. And I think it also just depends on the free agency class. We saw last year's running back group and interior offensive line group actually look pretty good. I mean, that's how the Panthers landed Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis. And I think the Bears would have taken a similar approach, but they were able to trade, like you said, some day 3 picks to get some of these starters that are going to be plug and play, and they are really going to be instrumental in how that team wins games. And I think that's one aspect of football that is currently underrated from a financial aspect is interior defensive linemen, interior offensive linemen, and I would say even linebackers and safeties. Everybody that's taking up kind of the middle of the field at the moment, I think is kind of underpaid from like a pay standpoint. And there could be a point where interior defensive linemen, and it is getting closer, gets to or maybe even passes edge play if some of these players really start impacting the game from the trenches and we see more Aaron Donalds and Chris Jones over the next few years.
To that point, and before we skip over the tight ends, not a ton of big name tight ends in free agency this offseason, but to your point with interior defensive linemen, I think that was a spot that had potential to be a big spending category this offseason. I think it was the last offseason, right, where we got Christian Wilkins. 2 years ago, we had the Derek Brown extension, Dexter Lawrence extension, a lot of big extensions. But going into this year, there was one guy that I thought could have made a ton of money, but the Cowboys threatened to tag and then eventually didn't tag, but signed to a long-term extension. Osa Odigizua, I believe I'm saying that correctly. They're really ferocious pass rushing interior defensive lineman. They signed him to a 80/4, so 20 million per year annual value with just under 60 million guaranteed. I like the deal for the Cowboys. I also like that the Cowboys are actually doing stuff in free agency. They're freeing up space, I think, assuming that they're about to extend Micah Parsons. But how do you view the Cowboys' actions here, choosing not to tag and getting a deal done before August? It seems like this never happens with them.
This was a little bit surprising. And from what it sounded like with Jason Fitzgerald, for a player of his caliber, this was a steal for them. You get a long 4-year deal and it's cheap. I mean, he's getting paid $20 million a year. And we're definitely going to see guys like Milton Williams, Javon Kinlaw, kind of approaching those numbers, if not surpassing, in the case of like a guy like Milton Williams. And I'd even say a guy like Tershawn Wharton. Gosh, I cannot speak. And that is a theme most episodes, but that's where I could see some of these players, they get that kind of caliber contract on the open market. And it only makes you wonder is if he had tested free agency, could he have commanded 22, 23? I don't know if he would have approached 24, but with some of these higher salary cap numbers and him being at the top of his position, it would not have surprised me.
Yeah, I think the next logical step is to like approach Chris Jones, not quite surpass. And I think that number is right around 30. And to your point, with the salary cap increasing, it gets less and less ridiculous to think about teams doing that. But then you mentioned Milton Williams. I think he's going to be the big fish in free agency this year. It wouldn't surprise me that if quarterbacks notwithstanding, if Milton Williams was the largest free agent acquisition in terms of overall contract, AAV, however you want to put it, I think he might get the biggest deal out of all the free agents, not including like extensions. Like if Jamar Chase gets extended, he's getting 40 a year or something ridiculous. But Milton Williams, Super Bowl winner, he's going to get the Super Bowl bump. Really good interior pass rusher. I think some team, maybe the Panthers, is going to pay him a ton of money.
So before we move on to the next position, we have breaking news, and we didn't talk about tight ends. I'll jump right back to that. I think the best guy available in the free agency market is Juwan Johnson at the tight end position. There's a lot of older veterans. A lot of these guys are around 30 years old. Austin Hooper, Mike Gesicki, guys like that. Tommy Tremble could command a contract, but the breaking news that Jacob is now catching up on, and I'll fill you all in, and obviously everyone who has Twitter is going to know about this before the podcast airs, but Trey Hendrickson has been given permission to seek a trade. So we are about to talk about edge players and guys that could kind of reset the market. This is where one of those instances, and he's obviously a little bit older. This would be kind of his third contract, second extension. I don't know if he would be top 5 at his position, but this is a contract negotiation where I think it is definitely going to be higher than what we're going to see a lot of the free agents get. Because, I mean, the top edge free agent I would kind of say right now is like Josh Sweat, Hassan Reddick. And I really feel like with the dead money, the void year that's on Josh Sweat's deal is that they're going to extend him and let Milton Williams walk. But again, I don't know how Howie Roseman's going to do that. It just, to me, those guys aren't necessarily on a Trey Hendrickson type level.
For sure. How nice of Hendrickson to request it right before we start doing edge rushers. I'm not so sure Josh Sweat's going to return just because they actually brought Zach Bond back, their all-pro middle linebacker who played excellent for them this season. With that and the Saquon deal, not sure if it's in the cards for them to spend big on some of their other current free agents. But like you said, Josh Sweat, he's going to get the Super Bowl bump as well. I think a team that's a contender is going to be willing to spend a lot of money to have a starting edge rusher that plays at an above average level, Pro Bowl level, however you want to call it. But Trey Hendrickson to that point, and then I kind of want to gear it a little bit more towards Trey talk right now. I think one thing people don't consider in the offseason when they're looking at, number one, cap space, and number two, how to build their teams, like how can fans look at it? If you're a team with a lot of cap space, I think it just makes more sense to go out and trade for players, because rather than just give them the contract that they have now, or like try to bid for them, get in a bidding war for them. If you trade for them, trade away a day 3 pick for like a Debo or something, or for Joe Thuney, you have the rights to them and you can extend them more early. And I think that's something people need to take more into account. With Trey Hendrickson, for example, top 8 edge rusher at minimum right now.
Yeah.
And
I mean, he led the league in sacks last year. I mean, the guy's got
he was like the only spot on the Bengals defense that kept them from being maybe just as bad as our own Panthers defense, right? And for the longest time, maybe since I've been alive, the Bengals have been like the cheapest organization, right? And the talk the past couple years with extending Joe Burrow, it's tagging T. Higgins twice now, and now eventually having to extend Jamar Chase's. They can't pay everybody. That owner is not going to want to pay everybody. This seems like the most obvious solution as to not pay everybody, because Joe Burrow did put pressure on them at the combine saying, hey, I want to play. I want Jamar to play here. I want T to play here. Well, if you want to keep your quarterback happy and you have to make concessions elsewhere, this seems like the logical point to do it.
It's funny in the AFC North. The Bengals are probably going to be one of the biggest spenders on the offensive side of the ball in the league. And the Steelers are known to be like the largest spenders of the past like decade on the defensive side. So like complete polar opposites. It'll make for some interesting divisional matchups on that.
And you know what I just thought of? With Sam Hubbard retiring, and if Trey Hendrickson leaves, they got to find 2 new starters at edge rusher.
And the defense was already pretty devoid of like talent and starters. So they have a long way to go. We will get more into that as we talk about the offseason. But another defensive position, you touched on the Zach Bond extension. I don't know if any free agent linebacker is really going to touch that. And it's funny because this is an Eagles team that shelled out money last offseason for Devin White, paid him more money than they paid Zach Bond. And they shelled out money for Bryce Huff, the one edge rusher from the New York Jets. And it'll be interesting to see if Bryce Huff is on the team. Obviously, I think Devin White was a 1-year deal. He's not even on the roster anymore. So when you start looking at some of those like details, it is very interesting of how some of the players that you think are going to perform well based on contracts, it's the cheaper guys that end up overperforming. So Zach Bond, the only guy I think to get back on track that could compete with his APY would be like a Dre Greenlaw. Obviously, he's coming off that injury he suffered in the Super Bowl, the non-contact one against the Chiefs, played a little bit at the end of last year. He's a really prospect because I think talent-wise, he's one of the best linebackers if healthy. Yeah. I think there are a lot of linebackers this free agency class, which we'll get into the Panthers in a little bit. But this is kind of, I would say, the avenue to get players in free agency really does seem to be this position group.
Yeah, it seems like every year you can find a plug-and-play starter in free agency at linebacker, as long as you have somebody else there to pair alongside them. Like Panthers example, Shaq Thompson came back healthy. They go and get Josie Jewell, and they draft Trevin Wallace. They're going to have to do something like that again this offseason. I would assume so. And then corner, this one maybe like the least sexy of all the positions in terms of free agency groups this year. Another 49ers free agent, Charvarius Ward, might lead in that group. DJ Reed of the Jets, I guess formerly of the Jets now, he might lead in that. I think he actually has a good chance of being one of the highest paid. And I think a guy from the Saints has a good chance of getting a lot of money. It's just he's dealt with a bit of nasty injury luck over the past couple of years. Paulson Adebo, he played well for them at quite a few positions, but he had quite the injury. A femur break is not easy to come back from.
He was below average in yards allowed per like coverage snap. I wasn't a big fan of him as a cover guy. I think he was definitely a good tackler. And from that standpoint, when you need bigger bodies, when you're playing lighter boxes, that makes sense. But from a coverage standpoint, he wasn't necessarily my favorite. Like you said, not a sexy group. Would be very interesting to see where some of these guys go. If Charvarius Ward, maybe he reconnects with Kansas City, signs like a 1-2 year deal. I think they're really missing another cornerback to go alongside Trent McDuffie. So just something to keep an eye on, monitor as they're kind of reshuffling their roster. To go into safeties, Justin Reed for the Chiefs. He's hitting free agency. I don't think he's going to be extended. Doesn't seem like he will be. Him and Javon Holland, I think, are going to be the two top money getters in terms of not only APY, but a multi-year extension with whoever signs them.
Yeah, I think Holland and Reed certainly are going to be up there. Trevon Merrick from the Raiders, I think, will garner a lot of attention, as will Cam Bynum from the Vikings. I think he'll get quite the look as well. Coming out of a pretty successful year in the Florio, the Brian Flores defense of the Vikings. And that kind of leads us into the Panthers group, right? We talked about some of the big names, and while I certainly would love if we were able to get Milton Williams, Josh Sweat, Javon Holland, Dre Greenlaw, and everybody else, that's just not realistic at the moment. And I thought,
I wanted all the Lego sets off the shelf growing up, but you can't get it all. You only have so much money.
You only have your budget, right? And they can move some money around, find some coins in between the couch cushions, so to speak, to get a little bit more of a budget. But there's a limit there, unless they want to go full Saints, and you should never go full Saints. And I thought one of the more interesting quotes from Radio Row from the Combine from our own Brant Tillis, our executive vice president, is with free agency, we want to make it to where if we had to play an NFL game on April 23rd, which is the day before the draft, we could be able to do that with the free agents that we sign. And to me, that means, hey, let's fill out all of our needs in free agency so we can truly be best player available at pick 8, or wherever we end up picking could go up or back. You never know. But to that point, the team has a lot of needs, right? We were, again, the worst defense of all time. So I think the premium needs for us are going to be defensive line. Like a Milton Williams makes a lot of sense to me to plug alongside Derek Brown and A'Shaun Robinson. Or edge rusher, like Josh Sweat makes sense, but I don't really think you can pay both of them, right? So if you go get Milton Williams, you're going to have to do stuff on the margins for edge rushers, like maybe a Josh Uche, who I thought would have gotten a ton of money last offseason. He didn't, and then he ended up getting traded. Charles Omenihu, another Chiefs player, or a guy like Harold Landry, who's available for trade now, apparently from the Titans, as they're trying to get younger. Like that would be the concession if you go big on the interior. And then vice versa, if you manage to get Josh Sweat, well, then you got to go for like Tershawn Wharton from the Chiefs, who you mentioned earlier. Draymond Jones, who was a big name free agent, I think 2 off seasons ago now with the Seattle Seahawks. They just cut him a couple of days ago, and he had his best year when Ejiro Evero was his defensive coordinator. So maybe there's a reunion there. What are your priorities, so to speak, for the free agency groups for the Panthers this year?
So when we look at the Panthers free agency, we have to look at some of the moves that have to be made before some of these signings. Because when we talk about a Milton Williams or a Josh Sweat or some of these like higher price free agents, that's going to be most of your like cap space as of right now. And currently, when you look at over the cap, or the current cap space for the Carolina Panthers is $29.86 million. You can open up a lot more with restructuring or extending Moten to the tune of 10 plus million. Similarly with Horn, he's about $9 million if you extend him. If you cut Sanders and Tuttle, you're going to give yourself about $11 or $12 million more. So with those kind of moves, you can get to a point where you double the cap space that you're walking currently into free agency with, which I think is going to be huge. And then I think the big thing is you need to spend, if you're going to spend money in free agency, on non-premium positions, because more than likely those are going to be elite players at positions that aren't necessarily deemed as valuable. And if you're trading for and drafting the premium positions and you're hitting on those and extending those players when their contracts come up, you can balance in such a way where your roster stays loaded and you don't feel overburdened with having to always be taking these non-premium positions higher in the draft. Like, oh, do we need to take a guard in the second round? No, we don't have to do that because we got Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis, and that kind of frees you up to go in a different direction. So with the defensive line, what I would like to see, honestly, like I think Mason Graham is going to be there for us at 8. I hope so. I know that in some cases that may not be the case, but he's falling down a lot of people's draft boards because he's quote unquote undersized, even though the tape shows nothing of the sort, in my opinion, of that slowing him down. So you get a guy like him. That makes me a little bit worried about signing a guy like Milton Williams, but I think you still need to get some depth there. So Draymond Jones, he used to kind of play for Ejiro Evero in Denver during that 1 or 2 season stint there. Edge, you see the Brant Tillis connection in Kansas City. Charles Omenihu, who you brought up, he was part of signing him and bringing him to Kansas City. So do we bring him in and have him on a depth rotation with Clowney and DJ Wanham? And those are the things to kind of think about from like a defensive line perspective. But I really think we got to find that cornerback too in free agency. We can find safeties in free agency. Those are the positions that we really need to be going after on the defensive side. I think the defensive line can be addressed not only with some free agency guys that are like vet min deals, but really focusing in on the draft being the focal point for that group.
Whatever it is, we got to get a lot of them, right? It's not just starters that we need, it's depth. Yeah. So I think you got a twofold address. Like if you're not big game hunting, like you're saying at interior, D-line, and edge, you got to get quite a few vets, like 2 at each position, and then draft some of them high. I think that's where you're trying to get at. And then the other non-premium positions are like you're saying, safety. I think that is where you need to spend big. Like a Javon Holland, I think would work well. I think like a Cam Bynum would work well. Tight end, not defensive heavy, but I think we need tight ends. I think JT Sanders is our only tight end on the roster currently. Maybe trade for a guy like Michael Mayer. He seems to be, the report is that he's available. The Raiders tight end, former second round pick, not second overall pick. I was very, very high on him in the draft. He could have been the second overall pick in that class if things fell correctly, but they didn't. If Brock Bowers has already pushed him out, maybe push for him. Maybe sign a veteran guy. Like we're going to have to get somebody because you can't go into the draft with one guy in your tight end room. So they're going to have to do something there. Center, another non-premium position traditionally. We don't have a starting center right now. And we have quite a few guys that played that spot for us that are available on the free agent market. Austin Corbett could come back, but I think every year he's had a significant injury that he was here. Obviously, the first year it happened in the final game, the Steve Wilkes game versus it was the Saints, right? That we won 10-7, where Darnold didn't throw a touchdown, but we somehow won that game. Caden Mays came in off the Giants practice squad, played well. Brady Christensen, like kind of a jack of all trades player. We could go for any of them or get a brand new guy or take a center on day 3. There are quite a few centers in this class that I think will be drafted, particularly on day 3. And a lot of times center is kind of a plug and play position if he fits your scheme well. And those are kind of the and then corner too, like you mentioned. I wouldn't mind bringing Mike Jackson back. I thought he performed admirably, but I think they will look to address corner probably day 2 of the draft, if I had to guess.
Yeah, I think the guys that kind of look at from that standpoint, I know you have here in parentheses in the notes Mike Jackson, but I was not a big fan of how consistently defenses were targeting him. He was definitely playing physical, definitely a guy that I would not mind bringing back and providing depth. But I think you got to really go out for a guy like Adoree Jackson or Rasul Douglas, where you can trust them on an island next to JC Horn. And if you can get that, because that was the idea with Dane Jackson, is you're getting a true cornerback too. I don't think Mike Jackson fits that billing. And I think if you're really trying to secure that back end, getting a guy like him, maybe spending, like you're saying, money for Javon Holland or some of these other safeties that might be on the market. Justin Simmons is a free agent. Maybe you're able to bring him in on a 1-year deal, even though he is in his 30s, and just get kind of something out of that. Like you said, trading for a tight end. Instead of going out and paying a guy $4 million in a year, go trade for a guy that's on a rookie contract that's going to provide a lot of boost in terms of versatility, not only in the run game, but the pass game. And I think him and JT Sanders would be very complementary to each other. So a lot of good points, but I think the big key thing here is, hey, definitely reinforce the trenches, both at that center position, whether that's re-signing guys that were on our team, and then the defensive line. Like, those two things have to get fixed. I think a lot of the other pieces or holes, so to speak, it's like you draft one or two pieces, you sign one or two big players, and all of a sudden those rooms, those positions look a lot better.
For sure. Games are won in the trenches, as like a million different people say every year. And I think there's nothing more important for us to address than at least the defensive trench, as it were. And to that point, I think it's time for us to get into Purrfect Takes territory. It's been almost a month since either of us have officially fired off a perfect take. And I think I will get us started with, I think the Panthers will be the top spender at one or two different defense position groups in free agency. I think the one that I'm quite confident in is safety. If you look at our roster, do you know how many safeties are on our roster?
We have like two right now that are under contract?
One, Damani Richardson, the undrafted free agent, who played, to his credit, a very, very good you got a lot out of him for being an undrafted free agent. I don't feel comfortable walking into next year or walking into the draft with just him on the safety depth chart. So I think they're going to spend at least on two safety free agents. Maybe you get Javon Holland and go for an older vet like Justin Simmons, who played with Ejiro Evero in Denver. And then I also think that we could see the Panthers being the number one interior defensive line spender. I know that they have Derek Brown and A'Shawn Robinson still under contract, but I really think after such a putrid performance against the run last year, they're going to bring in at least two new faces to help shore that up. And I know Milton Williams isn't an elite run stopper, but they need all the help they can get in the interior. So lock it in, number one safety spender out of all the teams, and it wouldn't shock me to see them spend the most on the interior D-line.
Yeah, I could see them doing what they did last offseason, where you're throwing a lot of different bodies at the defensive line and hoping you don't have like a DJ Wanham, Derek Brown situation where guys are injured and missing most of the year. Mm-hmm. And at that rate, you do have a healthy rotation. And that's where I think you brought up a guy, and we talked about him prior, Josh Uche. Where we talk about DJ Johnson scoring really well in run stopping. He's a guy that third down, you can tell him to go after the quarterback, and he's going to get after the quarterback. And you need some of those guys for some of these various different situations you're going to face in game, because it sometimes does come down to one or two plays. And if you have those playmakers in position, then all of a sudden these close games where you're losing them last year, you're actually finding a way to win. And so that's kind of what you want to build on as a team. Another key point to make, though, even though we are talking about some of these guys that can be difference makers from free agency, this isn't how you build a team. You build it through the draft. We've drafted Bryce Young. We drafted Taylor Moton. We drafted Ike Ekwonu. We drafted Derek Brown. We drafted J.C. A lot of our stars that have been retained will be retained. Those are the guys that we drafted, and we drafted a couple other guys that we're hoping really can take that step. And that's what you have to bank on, not the guys that you're signing that are proven commodities in the NFL. Because again, NFL careers are not that long, and people seem to forget that the shelf life for some of these players is over and done in a matter of a second.
For sure. And that's why you see a lot of big names that have been cut over the last 3 or 4 days, like Tyler Lockett. We barely glossed over him. One of the great Seahawks receivers was Tyler Lockett, 10-year veteran.
He might have a lot of like their records. Like, I'm not exactly sure, but he's got to be up like top 5, top 3 in terms of receiver and the yards, the receptions, maybe even touchdowns. But it's just crazy. To build off your take, I do think the Panthers are going to be massive spenders on the defensive side. I don't know exactly what the blueprint is, and we're going to see kind of the direction they take. I think if they do spend like what we talked about on non-premium positions, getting a linebacker, getting a safety, maybe finding a cornerback too, those things are the priority in free agency. And I'm hoping Dan Morgan hits it out of the park with who he goes after in this offseason. My perfect take is going to be, I really do think when we talked about kind of opening up some of this cap space so you can go after these guys that'll make a difference, that means getting rid of some of the dead weight. And that means cutting Miles Sanders and cutting Shy Tuttle. And Shy Tuttle, a great personality, was somebody that jived really well with Derek Brown. He's a guy that's counting too much against the cap, and he did not make a difference last year. I think if him and Ashawn Robinson, had they been a good tandem down the stretch, it's like, okay, this is the depth you want. He didn't provide that boost. You need to save some money. You open up 10 plus million just cutting those two players. So I think between now and the start of free agency next Wednesday, those two guys are no longer at least on the roster with their current deal.
For sure, I can see both of those things happening. Could also see the aforementioned Taylor Moton, J.C. Horn extensions that could also free up money. I'm actually expecting the J.C. Horn extension before free agency starts. I think he earned it with his play last year, and because this will be on his 5th year. They can save money this year because it's cheaper and worth the extension. If you know cap stuff, you know how that works. With that in mind, we're going to be back full time now, Tuesday and Thursday. And by the time we record on Tuesday, free agency, the negotiating period will have already started. So a lot of these names that we talked about, Milton Williams will probably have found his next team. Josh Sweat, some of these big names, Javon Holland, a lot of these veterans that have been cut. Maybe they go to familiar places. We'll know about all of that. We'll probably gloss over some of those before we start talking about quarterbacks in general, and more so quarterbacks in the draft next Tuesday. But until then, keep pounding. We're glad to be back, and we will catch you when we catch you next week.